Thank you. Well, first, I do want to apologize if my comment was taken in a wrong way, and I probably used very much probably the wrong choice of words, as our earlier speaker said. I believe that the people have the right, there's a mechanism in place. If someone wants to put this on the ballot, they have every single right to do that. I myself have been in times where I've petitioned and I've gone out and collected signatures, and I've done it myself. So I absolutely believe that's the right thing to do, and you absolutely have the right. My comment was made in the context that I heard two other council members say they didn't like the current one in front of them, but they liked that one less, and so they were going to approve something they didn't really like, and that's why I made my comment. Was it proper? Probably not the best choice of words, so I do apologize if you took that wrong. I absolutely support the fact that you have the right to go out and work to have something put on the ballot, so please accept my apologies if that was taken to be less than appropriate. Having said that, I do have some comments I want to make, and I, like Mr. Kildee, feel this is indeed our opportunity to make our reasons known for why we take a position, and so I'm going to take that opportunity. But before I begin, I want to make it absolutely perfectly clear this has nothing to do with me personally. I can't speak for the rest of the council, but I can't imagine myself sitting here 12 years from now wanting to run for office again. So whether term limits pass or doesn't pass, it won't have an effect on my running for city council. It's quite an anomaly that this Camarillo has such a veteran council, and this probably will not happen again with or without term limits. Camarillo has the reputation of being a well-run city and desirable city in which to live and work. This veteran, stable city council has a lot to do with that. My thoughts on the subject of term limits come from many years of public service and from working with and observing the many other cities within California, as well as other jurisdictions and agencies within the state. But most importantly, my opposition to Mr. Trimbley's proposal comes from my most basic philosophical ideal, that voters have the right to choose who they wish to vote for. Every registered voter gets one vote, and everyone who is 18 years of age or older and lives within the jurisdiction has the right to run for city council. I do not believe that Mr. Trimbley or the voters of today should place a restriction on the voters of tomorrow and tell those voters of the future who they can't vote for. If the voters of tomorrow want to vote for an incumbent, that should be their right, their choice, not Mr. Trimbley's proposal. I believe it does punish incumbents, but who do a good job, but most of all, it restricts the rights of voters in the future. Being an incumbent can be a good thing, and being an incumbent can be a bad thing. If everything is going well, it's a good thing, and there's a probability and a good chance you'll be reelected, not because you're an incumbent, but because the voters are happy with the way things are going. But if things aren't going well, if people are not happy with the state of the city or the job a council member is doing, then being an incumbent is not a good thing. Being an incumbent under those conditions will probably get you fired by the voters, if, of course, there is a better candidate to choose from. Since our last meeting, I have done some research on term limits, and while everyone can twist a subject to suit their purpose, there does not seem to be any indication that term limits imposed at the state legislature level on down has had a positive impact. Rather, there seems to be more negatives than positives. Regarding term limits at the California state legislature level, first, a correction. Proposition 140 establishing term limits for California state legislature was passed in 1990, not 1978, as Mr. Trimbley stated at the last meeting. Then Proposition 28 in 2012 made some changes to the provision for term limits, trying to correct problems with Proposition 140. One interesting study I read was from the Public Policy Institute of California. That study made some interesting points. The study found, and I quote, "The authors find that term limits altered but revolutionize the type of legislator who comes to Sacramento. Rather than representing a new breed of citizen legislator, new members after term limits behave a great deal like their predecessors. Many have local government experience and run for another office, for assembly or for state senate, when their terms expire. Careerism remains a constant in California politics. They also noted that legislative oversight of the executive branch has declined significantly. Frequent changes to the membership and leadership of legislative committees diminish their expertise in many important policy areas. Many committees lack the experience to weed out bad bills and to ensure that agencies are acting efficiently and in accordance with legislative intent. Nothing in my research led me to change my mind that overall term limits have not had a positive effect on our state government. Having witnessed our state legislature before and after term limits, I believe it is one of the worst things that has happened to our state government. Sacramento is run by lobbyists and staff members, with many elected representatives moving from one office to another. Many, knowing they don't have long in office, push through some of their pet projects and some of the worst ideas for the state, and then agree to other members' pet projects just to get their own through. This is particularly problematic as they often are long gone before they would have to deal with the results of those decisions, and more often than not, the unintentional consequences of the new laws. Mr. Trimbley continues to point to Ventura, Thousand Oaks, and the Board of Supervisors as local governmental agencies with term limits that have been successful. I believe that statement is misleading to the public. While term limits have been passed in those jurisdictions, I do not know how you can come to that conclusion about term limits and the fact that they've been successful, since there has not been an election when an incumbent has been termed out and not eligible to run again. Thousand Oaks and Ventura and the Board of Supervisors have indeed instituted term limits, 3 4-year terms. Interestingly, put on the ballot by already long-term members of those jurisdictions, and none of them have termed out yet. The Board of Supervisors first imposed term limits in 2007, and I believe Steve Bennett last year was elected to his final term. Mrs. Long elected to retire before running for her final eligible term. So it is yet to be determined how successful the concept has been in Ventura, Thousand Oaks, and the Ventura County Board of Supervisors. Another important note is Camarillo is not Ventura or Thousand Oaks, and certainly not the County Ventura Board of Supervisors. Camarillo is a much smaller city with our own culture and political history. I hope Camarillo never reaches the $100,000 mark or adopts the big city type of politics or the influence of big money. Since our last meeting, a resident brought some information to my attention regarding the City Council election in 2016. Something that has occurred in Ventura and Thousand Oaks often but has never happened in Camarillo before, and something I hoped would never happen, but it occurred. In Camarillo's 52-year history prior to 2016, no one has ever spent over $55,000 on a city council election. In our city's history, our local government's elected officials were elected because of their hard work and proven record, or getting out and working for name recognition, not because they bought that name recognition. Mr. Trimbley spent over $55,000 on his campaign for city council in 2016. Almost $20,000 came from Mr. Trimbley personally, and $9,000 from a family member, and this is, of course, all public record. The balance was from donations, many attorneys, and a number of donations from outside of Camarillo. And interestingly, of the over $55,000, only $839 was from donations under $100. And in this, for the first time in Camarillo's history, a council member spent over $35,000 on a political consulting firm to run his campaign and $2,000 on a treasurer. How many people can afford to do that? Once one candidate is willing and able to spend that much money, the money competition begins, but only for those who can afford it. The rest are left out. Mr. Trimbley states good candidates don't come forward because they lack name recognition to be elected when running against incumbents. Mr. Trimbley is pushing term limits to create open seats and give more people the opportunity to run and win. I have to ask how many people can afford to spend over $30,000 of your own money and spend $55,000 to win a seat on our local city council. In Mr. Trimbley's world, election world, that would be, you'd have to be rich. Up until the last election, the most spent on a city council election was $21,000. It was an oddity and the most ever spent. In our history, there were a few who spent no money, but the average ranged from $2,800 to $9,000. One might say, well, he had to do it to have that name recognition, to beat an incumbent, to which I would say, I would rather have an incumbent who has earned that name recognition than someone who can afford to buy it. And once that money game begins, it won't matter if incumbents are there to be voted for. The one with the most money wins. And then the question, when you raise that much money, who do you owe what? Turning Camarillo politics into a model after the larger cities of Ventura and Thousand Oaks is not in keeping with our city, our size, that hometown feel and culture we cherish. To make Camarillo into Ventura and Thousand Oaks does not sound like a good idea to me. Another question that was raised, regarding the money spent by Mr. Trimbley in the last election is the hiring of his campaign consultant, Rincon. Interestingly, when you visit their homepage under Winning for Our Client, they list Shea Homes and Oakmont Senior Living. Describing Oakmont Senior Living development on their homepage, they say, they developed and executed a community relations strategy to grow support for the proposed Oakmont Assisted Living Facility in Camarillo, California, in order to counter and correct misinformation brought forth through local neighborhood opponents. Since Rincon had helped get him elected a few months earlier, one might think he would at least mention that relationship before voting against the residents, those neighborhood opponents. Another interesting question that was raised by this resident regarding Mr. Trimbley's campaign fundraising: does it seem quite right that an attorney with the city attorney's firm, Burke Williams, donated $200 to Mr. Trimbley's campaign? Why mention these items that were brought to my attention? While technically not illegal, it shows big city problems being brought into Camarillo city government, and term limits such as Ventura and Thousand Oaks is a big city issue. An elected official is elected by the voters for a specific term. With the city council, it is for 4 years. If the elected official wishes to seek re-election and the voters make that decision to re-elect that individual, he or she will serve for another 4 years. Every 4 years, voters get to decide who they want to represent them on the city council. It isn't a social club where everybody gets a chance. The voters make this decision who they want to elect. To set an arbitrary time limit on the voters' choice is unfair to the voters. Mr. Trimbley today should not be telling the voters of tomorrow who they cannot vote for. If the majority of the voters like what is going on in their city and wish to re-elect someone and that they think is doing a good job, then that's their choice, not yours. If the voters choose the known over the unknown, then it's their choice to make, not yours. Mr. Trimbley states term limits enhance citizen government so that new council members can bring fresh ideas and perspectives to the council. New ideas for the sake of new ideas is not necessarily a good thing, particularly when brought forth without an understanding of the city or the governmental process under which the state and local governments must operate. I have watched cities throughout California bounce back and forth as a council member, frequently to change positions. What sounds like a good idea may turn out to be a disaster. When they swing one way and then they swing back the other way, and they never seem to find stability. And there usually is also a constant change in city staff that follows, which also adds to that instability. One does not have to be on the city council to get involved or offer new ideas. There are many, many organizations within our community where an individual can get involved and better our community. The city has committees in which they can serve. Any member of the public can bring forth their ideas and comments, both positive and negative. We can list many programs and changes that have occurred because members of the public have brought it forward. Probably the most recent is the Clean Power of Southern California Joint Powers Authority that the city just brought. That was brought forward by members of the community. The 5 members of our city council are elected to represent the public, and every member of the public has the opportunity to have their voice heard. They call, they write, they can attend city council meetings, and they can attend city events. Local government is the government closest to the people and held more accountable by the people. We live and work in the community and don't head off to Sacramento or Washington, D.C. No matter where we go, we interact with our citizens of our community. Mr. Tremblay states good candidates don't come forward because they lack name recognition to be elected when running against an incumbent. There are indeed many people in our community who would probably make very good council members. However, many of these people have no desire to serve in that capacity and would rather serve in other ways. Many are too busy with their own families and work. And many, when they realize the time involved, the responsibility you assume, and the criticism you must endure, they decide not to put themselves in that position. There have been some who have run for city council with no idea what the job entails and have been glad in the end they were not elected. And there have been some that have run for the office that the voters have recognized would probably not be successful or represent them well. Just because someone wants to be a city council member does not mean they should be elected to give them their chance. The voters get to decide who they want to elect to represent them, and they should not be limited in that choice. Mr. Tremblay implies being an incumbent and having name recognition is a bad thing and keeps good people from running for office. Being an incumbent can be a good thing, and it can be a bad thing. If things are going well, it is a good thing. If things are not going well, it's a bad thing. Because the city of Camarillo is good, and it's a well-run city, Mr. Tremblay wants to restrict incumbents instead of thanking them and let the voters decide if they want the incumbent to continue working for them. In most cases, particularly in a town our size, the voters want to elect someone they know or have heard about. That is, if things are going well. In a community our size, it does not and should not take a lot of money to fund a campaign, unlike larger cities or higher office. Someone can be elected if they're willing to work hard for the job and gain that name recognition. One should not expect serving on the city council to be their first step in gaining name recognition. Hopefully, a candidate runs to serve their community and not as simply a stepping stone to a higher office. If you want to gain name recognition and get elected, get involved. Work for your community and prove yourself. As I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of ways to get involved in our community. We need good people to get out and work for our community. Our city motto is, indeed, the city is the people. It doesn't say the city is the city council. It really is easy to complain about what is happening and a lot harder to get out and work to make it better. There are many benefits for having long-term seasoned council members able to deal with a huge variety of issues. There is a benefit to having council members with experience, giving them the ability to represent the city on regional and state boards and committees. To have a constant turnover in council members will diminish the city of Camarillo's influence in regional and state issues. Being a city council member is not just about getting elected to fulfill a certain goal. Rather, it's about serving your community. A one-issue candidate, unless they can quickly change and adapt, does not make a very good council member. The time commitment is huge and the responsibility even greater. A good council member needs to listen, learn, analyze, and weigh the pros and cons on a large array of issues and topics, and always remember they were elected to represent the people, not themselves. Ultimately, every 4 years, it is up to the voters to decide, do they like the way things are going, or do they want to change? I do not support the City Council placing the measure on the ballot, although I certainly, everyone has the right to go out and to collect signatures and get a measure on the ballot. But to have the City Council place that question on the ballot implies the City Council's support. If they don't want it, some would say, well, why in the world did they put it on the ballot? As the resolution before you tonight says, the analysis shall include a statement indicating the measure was placed on the ballot by the Camarillo City Council. If you vote to place this on the ballot, you will own it. You don't get to add a footnote that says, we don't really support this, just didn't want something else. If you support the idea of term limits, then vote to put it on the ballot. If you don't support the idea of term limits, then don't vote to put it on the ballot. And if Mr. Tremblay wants to see term limits on the ballot, then let him go out, just like this other group, and work for it. If he can collect 4,000 signatures to place the issue on the ballot, then that shows there is some support for the issue, and it should go to the voters. It is interesting, since Mr. Tremblay sent his letter to the editors of both newspapers stating his position on term limits, and that he was going to take it to the City Council, obviously wanting to drum up support. We only heard from 2 of his supporters at the last meeting and received a few letters from his campaign supporters. There have been 2 letters to the editor since our last meeting in response to the issue, 1 for and 1 against. The Acorn newspaper, while endorsing the idea in the end, gave many pros and many cons to the proposition. And there has been discussions, as I said earlier, online, some for, some against. All depends on what website you go to. But there has not been a huge groundswell pushing the City Council to place the issue on the ballot. Will many people vote for it? Probably. Do most people really care? Probably not. Is it in the best interest in Camarillo's future? I don't think so. Let the future generations decide who they want to vote for. Don't let Mr. Tremblay, in this case, tell them they can't vote for it. If Mr. Tremblay wants it so badly, let him go out and work for it and collect the signatures. If the City Council places it on the ballot, then we own it, each and every one of us. There will not be a footnote that says 4 of us really don't support this. If the issue is placed before the voters, I do hope the voters will think about the issue on the local level, think about our city, think about future generations of voters, and not let the dysfunction that occurs at the state and federal level guide their vote. And if you are inclined to vote yes because you think the current council members have served too long, please remember this doesn't have any effect on the current City Council. It's about future generations. Let them decide for themselves who they want to vote for. So you obviously can tell I don't support the City Council placing the measure on the ballot. I support anyone who wants to go through the effort to have a measure put on the ballot. That is certainly their right. And if they have supporters and want to do that, it is something that the voters can then decide on.